Chapter 9. Hic, ille, and iste. Chapter 9 covers the following: the nature of demonstrative pronouns, the formation of hic, iste, and ille, and special adjectives which decline like demonstrative pronouns. And at the end of the lesson, we'll review the vocabulary which you should memorize in this chapter. There is one important rule to remember in this chapter. Demonstrative pronouns and related forms have ius in the genitive singular and I in the dative singular. Demonstrative pronouns. Demonstrative pronouns, like English words this and that, point at something. They're often used as adjectives. For instance, this book or that tree. In English, demonstrative pronouns take a different form in the plural. This becomes these, and that becomes those, making them one of the few English adjective forms which are different in the singular and plural. Though they are at heart adjectives, because they so often stand alone, it's almost better to consider them pronouns. A pronoun is a part of speech. It's usually a small word which represents and stands in place of a noun. For instance, we were looking for a new house to buy, and we found it. It represents and stands in place of the new house. Pronouns are some of the most useful forms in language. They allow us not to have to repeat a noun every time we want to mention it. Consider the nursery rhyme about Old King Cole. What if it didn't have pronouns? It would go, Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was Old King Cole. Old King Cole called for Old King Cole's pipe. Old King Cole called for Old King Cole's bowl. Old King Cole called for Old King Cole's fiddlers 3.
The next thing Old King Cole needs to call for is some pronouns.
Demonstratives can function as pronouns as well as adjectives. So, for instance, you can say, let's move there. That's a good idea. In the second sentence, the demonstrative form that functions as a pronoun because it represents and stands in place of the idea of moving there. So demonstratives can serve as either adjectives when they modify a noun, or pronouns when they stand alone. Here's one idea expressed both ways. I like that thing, where that is an adjective modifying thing. Or you can just say, I like that, in which case that is a pronoun representing and standing in place of that thing. If you haven't seen this already for yourself, another way to look at this pronoun usage is that the demonstrative pronoun is serving as a substantive, that is, an adjective which functions as a noun. And do you remember where Latin substantives get their substance? That's right, from their gender. English pronouns are the only place where there's anything corresponding to that practice in our language. Our pronouns are, in fact, archaic forms, retaining grammatical information which our nouns and adjectives have long lost. For instance, gender, he, she, it. Number, I versus we. You versus y'all. He, she, or it versus they. And even case. He is nominative, his is genitive, him is accusative. She is nominative, her is genitive and accusative. It is nominative and accusative, it's genitive. There's a fascinating detail here. Notice that he has an accusative form him, she has an accusative form her, but it does not have a distinctive accusative form. It serves as both the nominative and accusative. And that's because neuter nominatives and accusatives are always the same. Just like Latin, English is an Indo-European language, so it inherited the same tendency Latin did. And that's why English doesn't have a special neuter accusative form like itum, iter. It's enough. Our demonstratives retain archaic forms too. With number, for instance, as we noted before, this versus these, that versus those. The distinction between the singular and plural forms is a relic of the way that English used to treat all adjectives. which raises an important principle, one you should know, that the more common a word, the more likely it is to exhibit irregular forms, for the very simple reason that common words are heard more often and thus can support irregularity. So, for instance, we English speakers hear do, does, did, done every day, which means that verb can afford to be irregular, as can have, has, had. But not verbs like mitigate or incapacitate. They're simply not used enough to support irregularity. If do stopped being used so much, I guarantee you it would quickly regularize, and soon we'd be saying, he does it, I doed it, and down there in Texas they like their steaks well doed. The same holds true for Latin pronouns. Indeed, the similarities between ancient Rome and modern Texas are frightening. Many Latin pronoun forms exhibit archaic elements because they were used so often. So, for instance, the genitive singular of many pronoun forms is ius, an archaic form. Likewise, an archaic dative singular I ending is often seen. The neuter nominative and accusative singular of several pronouns ends with d, another relic of Latin's linguistic past, as is the deictic marker, a very old and very widespread form found in Indo-European languages, a k sound, most often spelled with c, appended to the end of a word to indicate that the speaker is pointing at something. Bearing all these archaic forms in mind can help with memorizing what might seem otherwise very irregular forms. And so here it is, your first Latin demonstrative pronoun, hic, haec, hoc, which means this in the singular, these in the plural. Let's recite it together, starting with the nominative singular masculine and going across the genders, as we did before with first-second declension adjectives. Hic, haec, hoc, huius, 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 huic, 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 hunc, hunc, hoc, 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 hoc. And now the plural. He, hi, haec, horum, harum, horum, his, his, hos, hos, haec, his, his. Need I importune you, as I always do, to recite these forms until they are seared into your brain, like overdewed meat? Come on! Hic, haec, hoc, huius, huius, huius. That's right. Keep doing it. Looking at hic, haec, hoc linguistically shows that it's not as irregular and unpredictable as it might seem on the surface. To begin with, the base is clearly H, to which have been added, for the most part, first and second declension endings. With, of course, one minor irregularity, H changes into HU in the genitive and dative singular. And the C deictic marker we discussed above shows up quite regularly, but in every instance except one, in the singular. In general, the singular is more irregular than the plural, so you'll just have to memorize hic, haec, hoc. But let's examine in detail the patterns that can help you with memorizing this form. For starters, the IUS genitive singular is the archaic form we mentioned above. It's an ending you'll see elsewhere among pronoun forms, as is the I embedded in the dative singular form huic, which ends with the deictic marker C. Hunc is arguably not irregular at all. It begins with the expected base H, to which is added UM, the second declension accusative masculine singular ending, and onto the end of that is added the deictic marker C. But because M and C are more easily pronounced as NC, the form becomes hunk. Exactly the same process produces hunk in the feminine accusative singular, which is at heart H plus AM plus C. The ablative singular is absolutely regular if you understand that the C at the end of all the forms is simply a deictic marker. But please make a note that the long mark on the masculine and neuter ablative singular forms hoc, is mandatory. The macron distinguishes those forms from the nominative and accusative neuter singular forms hoc. The plural is all but completely regular and predictable. It simply takes the base H and adds first, second declension plural endings, with only one minor irregularity. The neuter nominative and accusative plural forms use the deictic marker C, producing the form hic. Closely related to, but meaning the opposite of hic, is ille, illa, illud, meaning that or those. As a pronoun, it shares many features with hic. Here it is. Let's recite it together. Ille, illa, illud, ilius, 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 illi, 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 illum, illam, illud, illo, illa, illo. And in the plural, illi, illi, illa, illorum, illarum, illorum, illis, 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 illos, illas, illa, illis, illis, illis. Just as with hic, the masculine nominative singular ille is irregular. And also just like hic, ille exhibits the ius archaic genitive singular ending and the I archaic dative singular ending. But note that unlike hic, nowhere does ille use the deictic marker C. Well,
Not in classical Latin.
in earlier Latin it does. But ille does show an archaic form that hic lost, that is, D, in the neuter nominative and accusative singular, producing the form illud. Outside of that, all the other forms of ille, illa, illud follow the regular pattern for first, second declension adjectives, including the mandatory long mark in the ablative singular feminine, which is exactly what you would expect of a first declension form. Latin had another way of saying that, iste, ista, istud. This pronoun shows stronger pointing than ille. It's more deictic than ille. It's deicticer, if that's a word. It's not. And when Italians of any century are pointing at something, it can never be good. So iste, ista, istud was often associated in ancient society with condemnation. The way my Latin teacher taught me to translate iste was to say that man. So I pass on the tradition to you. Iste means that. And note that iste declines in exactly the same way as ille, illa, illud, including the genitive singular ius and dative singular I, with which you should be familiar by now. But those particular archaic endings are not restricted to hic, ille, and iste. They also show up in a series of adjectives which often function as pronouns in Latin. These include unus, alter, totus, ullus, solus, alius, and nullus. I expect you to know both the meaning of these words and that they use ius in the genitive singular and I in the dative singular. Let's end the grammar part of this lesson by addressing what may have occurred to some of you already, that demonstrative forms often serve as nouns, and when they do, just like substantive adjectives, they get their substance from their gender. For instance, hic can mean just this if it has a noun to modify, but it can also stand alone and mean this man if it doesn't. Likewise, istius can mean of that man, woman, or thing, or it can even mean simply his, hers, or its, as long as you understand that the Roman speaking is full of deicticism.
Also not a word.
Illas can mean those women, or simply them, in either case used in some sort of accusative function. Uni can mean two or four, one man, woman, or thing. Context will dictate which makes the best sense. Now that we're done with the grammar for this chapter, let's look at the vocabulary. The first word is locus, loci, masculine, meaning place or passage in literature. It's a second declension masculine noun, in the singular. In the plural, it swings two ways. It can be masculine, low-key, as you would expect from the singular, in which case it means passages in literature, like a quote from Virgil or a song in the Bible. But it can also be neuter, loka, in which case it means places, or region, singular. A region is, after all, a collection of places. This is a very rare thing in Latin. Most words have one gender and one gender alone, which makes locus a fascinating artifact of an argument the Romans were having among themselves about the nature of this word. Was it masculine or neuter? A decision they had not yet arrived at in the classical age. The next three words in the vocabulary list are hic, ille, and iste. We've already talked about their formation. Let's talk about their meaning. While this is as close an approximate as English has to hic, and that to ille, neither this nor that cover the meanings of hic and ille perfectly. For instance, English this almost always refers to something close, and that something far away. While the same can hold true of hic and ille in Latin, it doesn't always. Sometimes hic can refer to a thing more distant, and ille a thing closer, with one major exception where hic and ille conform exactly with English this and that. When the Romans were referring to two things that had been mentioned earlier, they used ille, that, to refer to the earlier one, it's further away, and hic, this, to refer to the later one, it's closer. Thus, ille can mean the former, and hic the latter. The next word, alter, altera, alterum, means the other. It's a first-second declension adjective. This is the Latin word that gives us words like alternate or alternative. Notice that those words have a connotation they've inherited from Latin, one of two, the other, as opposed to another, the Roman word for which is alius, alia, aliud, also a first-second declension adjective. Just like another, alias denotes something that is one out of three or more things. And, while this word is not listed in the vocabulary, please add it to this vocabulary list. It's a basic and commonly used word in Latin. Wheelock cites it on page 42, immediately above the vocabulary. And another thing, take careful note of the genitive singular of alius. It's alterius, a form borrowed from alter. It should be aliius if you take the base ali and add the archaic genitive singular ending ius. But the Romans didn't like saying aliius. However, if they did the obvious and contracted it to alius, then there was no difference between the masculine nominative singular and the genitive singular forms. Lots of potential confusion there. So they reached over to this word's close cousin, alter, and borrowed its genitive singular, alterius, with the result that alterius can mean of the other or of another, whichever the context demands. But this is the only form that causes this kind of confusion. Thus all other forms of alius, except the genitive singular, use the base ali, including the dative singular, which, as expected of a form that serves as a pronoun often, exhibits the archaic ending e, producing the form alii. Apparently, confusion between the dative singular and nominative plural masculine was not a problem. The next word is nullus, nulla, nullum, meaning no, not any, or none, another first-second declension adjective. Please note that this word does not mean not. It is not an adverb. It is an adjective. It does not modify verbs. It modifies nouns, as in, yes, we have no bananas, versus, we do not have bananas. Got it? Not bananas, no bananas. Good. Unless you like bananas. The correlative of nullus, that is, its closely paired form, is ullus, ulla, ullum, which is, like its twin, first-second declension. Please add this word also to your vocabulary. The next word, solus, sola, solum, means alone or the only. It's a first-second declension adjective. You should note that it's part of a Latin idiom, a complex conjunction cluster, non solum sed etiam, which means not only, but also. The next word, totus, tota, totum, means whole or entire, another first-second declension adjective. Let's see if you've been listening to this lesson. What's the genitive singular of totus? Well, put a star on your forehead if you said totius. The next word, unus, una, unum, means one, single, or alone. It's yet another first-second declension adjective. Here's an interesting question. What's the nominative plural masculine of this word? Trick question. How can you have the plural of the word one? Wait a second. No, it's not a trick question. Of course you can have a plural of one. One's a perfectly fine word. Here are the ones we like, and here are the ones we don't. Yar! And now back to our regular commentator. Ones means multiple individuals. So, returning to my question, what's the nominative plural masculine of this word? Very good. Uni. And uni would be identical to what form in the singular? Excellent. The dative singular. Unus is another of those pronoun forms that use ius in the genitive singular and I in the dative singular. At the end of this vocabulary list are three small words. The first is enim, meaning for, in fact, or truly. It's a conjunction, and it's post-positive. Do you remember what that means? Yes, it tends to be the second word in a sentence. Please note, this is not the same English word for that signals the dative case, as in, I did this for you, that is, in your behalf. This is the English word for that links two sentences, as in, I made these recordings for, I hope that one day you learn to love Latin as much as I do. The next word in we've already encountered, and noted that it can take either an ablative or accusative object. If it takes the ablative, it means in or on, and if it takes the accusative, it means into or onto. The final word in this vocabulary list is nunc, meaning now. It's an adverb. Note the C at the end of this word. It's yet another deictic marker, suggesting that the Romans, when they said this word, tended to point, as we do when we say, for example, memorize hic I hoc. Right now. Could you hear me pointing? So does the rule that was cited at the beginning of this chapter now make sense to you? If not, please review this presentation right now. Or if so, please proceed to the next slide. For the next class meeting, please bring in a copy of the worksheet for Chapter 9. Here's a link to that worksheet. And so concludes the presentation for Chapter 9. Et illud est illud, o discipuli.